harvest is a big deal because we get one shot a year to get it right. Our fruit ripens once a year, obviously, so it's an annual cycle. Lots of things can go wrong in the meantime, but harvest is where the culmination of a year's work, where the grapes ripen to the point where they're ready to be picked and harvested and made into wine. So there's a lot of risks to growing grapes, especially in the cool climates that we are here in the Alpine Valleys. It's very stressful. We are at heavy risk of frost during the growing season, which can really affect the crop load and also the quality for later on in the season. We often get late frosts, so it's something that we have designed our vineyard around to try and protect itself from frost. So we've got some of the later ripening and later shooting varieties planted in some of the more susceptible areas to frost, so hopefully they're still protected at that point. Hail is another thing that we tend to get a little bit of, which can be absolutely devastating to grapevines. Thankfully we haven't seen that for a couple of years, but sometimes we get some fairly strong summer storms here. Bushfires and planned burns is another big risk to us, and we work very, very closely with some of the local organisations who do the planned burns, and that conversation has got much more two-way in the past sort of 4 or 5 years. Smoke taint's another real risk we have here, especially down in southeast Australia in general, with wildfires and planned burns. Thankfully, in our 32 years of vintages, we have only had one that was severely smoke affected, which is a pretty good strike rate. Even though we do get a reasonable amount of smoke sometimes during that period, it's got to be a certain type of smoke and a certain intensity to have an effect on the grapes. So we are lucky in that regard. And probably one of the biggest factors we've got is the heat during the ripening period, and these sometimes you have these extended, 35 to low 40 degree temperature range during the ripening period, which can severely affect the grape quality. But thankfully here we tend to have that mitigating factor of the cooling effects of the mountains, which give the vines a little bit of reprieve. So hand picking, again, we've got a very much a philosophy here of low intervention. So, any good winemaker will tell you that most of the work's done out in the vineyard. Winemakers really are just custodians of what goes on in the vineyard. Part of that philosophy is around doing everything by hand. So we hand prune everything, minimal tractor work in the vineyard. The hand picking is a big part of that. And what that does is it sort of preserves the integrity of the grape for longer. As soon as you break that skin of the grape, the juice essentially starts to deteriorate. So what it does is allows those beautiful, delicate flavours to be preserved. The commercial reality for a lot of people is that they can't handpick. It's obviously something that is very costly and takes a lot more time. But we're only a fairly, in the scheme of things, a fairly small operation too. We sort of top out at about 120 tonne off our vineyard. And if we're picking thousands of tonnes, you just wouldn't be able to handpick. So it really fits in with our philosophy, as I said, of low intervention and pursuing those little 1%ers of high quality. So vintage 2019 was the one where we dodged a bullet. Mid to late January we had some absolutely record heat that if that was maintained during the rest of the ripening period, we probably would have been in a fair bit of trouble, and probably wouldn't have ended up the quality that we did. But about a week into vintage, we generally start harvest in sort of late February. So about a week into vintage, where we were picking in that 38 degree heat for the first few days, we had a big cool change come through, which really did save our bacon. It dropped the average daily temperature for the rest of the vintage by about 10 degrees. The cool night started kicking in as well. So it just allowed the vines to take a breath, spread themselves out a little bit again, slow up with their ripening. I didn't want things ripening as quick as they were. In the end, I've been absolutely blown away by the quality of the wines, especially the white wines. White wines can tend to be a little bit more delicate than red when they're out in the vineyard, but they have held up absolutely amazingly well. There's some incredible flavours, so some real complexity and depth and power in the flavours, and some wonderful textures in some of our late white ripening varieties too. So some of those thicker skin varieties that really hold up beautifully in these warmer temperatures during the ripening period have produced some amazing wines. The reds I'm still working on in the winery at the moment to sort of get them under oak. The maturation of our red wines takes about 2 years anyway, so it's during that process they can really not show themselves for a good 12 months maturing. But I'm extremely happy with how the vintage ended up. In a fabulous vintage, like, again, this has sort of happened in the last few years, I will essentially spend hours out there picking, tasting, and deciding on what's going to be picked next. Sometimes those decisions change 5 times in a day, but because we also have chosen a very varied number of different grape varieties, some are much later ripening than others, so they do tend to, in these wonderful vintages like we just had, follow on from each other a little bit, and you can pick them at basically almost at flavour ripeness as opposed to just at sugar ripeness, which is the dream of any winemaker to be doing that.